Well now, are you settled? If so, then let's do our little trick. Let your eyes stay just barely open, not looking, just letting the room loosen its edges on its own. Let the shapes sit where they are without needing to follow them, and you'll find that the longer you try to stay awake, the sooner sleep will come. Ease yourself down into the bed. Let it take over completely, holding you in place without any effort from you. Breathe slowly and stay absolutely still. And if you feel a faint, steady warmth resting on the blanket near your feet, ignore it. As long as you don't move, it won't come any closer. Now, let's begin tonight's stories. Consider this for a moment. Most people are able to sleep in a house that has an attic over their heads because they've made a quiet agreement with themselves. They've decided that whatever's up there is only wood, old dust, maybe a few boxes, or maybe a few mice. They've decided that because they don't go up there often, there's nothing up there worth knowing, and that agreement is what lets them turn over, pull the duvet higher, and let the night pass over them. But the attic is the one part of the house that almost nobody really knows. You know your bedroom, you know the shape of your wardrobe, you know where the chair is, you know the light from the hall that slips in under the door, you know the sounds of the pipes, you know the sound the window makes when the wind pushes against it. Even in the dark, your room belongs to you. The attic does not. The attic is above you, and because it's above you, it has a kind of authority. You can shut your bedroom door, you can lock your window, you can look under your bed if you have to, but you cannot lie in bed and look into the dark space directly over your ceiling. You can only listen to it. You can only imagine its depth. You can only picture the beams, the insulation, the rafters, and black corners where the torch doesn't quite reach. And that's where the mind begins to work on you. Consider this for a moment. If you hear a sound under your bed, at least there is a floor between you and it. If you hear a sound in the hall, at least there's a door. But if you hear something in the attic, it's already inside the house. It's already above your head. It's already somewhere you can't see, moving slowly through a space you do not control. That's what makes the attic different from every other fear in the home. It's not outside trying to get in. It already is in. There are ordinary explanations, and they're bad enough. Rats, for one. People say the word very quickly. Rats, as if saying it fast makes it smaller, but really picture it. Picture not one rat, but several. Picture them in the insulation. Picture them inside the walls. Picture the scratching that seems light when you first hear it. Then picture what the sound really means. Teeth and claws and little furry bodies. A nest somewhere in the dark. A place where they breed unseen over your head while you lie still and tell yourself it's only the house settling. That sound people call scratching isn't really scratching at all, is it? It's activity. It's life in a place where you hoped was dead. And once the idea takes hold, every small noise becomes harder to miss. A short scrape, a faint run, a sudden stillness after movement. The worst part is the pause. The pause tells you that something has stopped because it heard you hearing it. Now consider a stronger fear. Not an animal, a person. There are houses where the attic is never checked. There are homes where the hatch is opened once at Christmas for decorations and then shut again for 11 months. There are families who don't know what exactly is in the attic because they've inherited the mess from the people before them. Old bags, old toys, timber, broken lamps, rolls of carpet, black sacks. A shape covered with a sheet means nothing in daylight. It's only a shape covered with a sheet until you begin to ask how easy it could be for a man to stay up there. Maybe not comfortably, not well, just enough. A mattress dragged into the far end, bottles, food taken in pieces, a small torch, a coat, a place between beams where he can lie flat, where he hears someone below. A man doesn't need much to hide if he's patient enough and if the people below are busy enough. And there are worse thoughts than a stranger in the attic. There's the thought of a stranger in the attic who's been there long enough to know your timings, when you switch the lights off, when you get up to use the toilet, which floorboards click outside your bedroom, whether you sleep with the window open or whether you live alone, whether you look up at the hatch before bed. Now, think about this. Imagine lying there at night and realizing that the sound overhead isn't random movement. Imagine realizing it happens only after the whole house goes quiet. Imagine the steps are careful and measured and spaced. Imagine hearing one creak, then another, then nothing for a long time, then another. That's not an animal, that's thought. And once the mind opens that door, it doesn't close it again easily. Because then you begin to think of the hatch. Every house with an attic hatch has a point in the ceiling that asks for trust. A square or rectangle fitted into the plaster. A little ring, a line around the edge. Something simple, something ordinary, something you're expected not to think about. But that little panel is all that stands between your room and that black space above. You tell yourself it's secure. You tell yourself it sits flush. Then, one night, because your mind is not your friend, you glance up and wonder whether it always sat quite like that. Was that gap always visible along one side? Was that ring always hanging at that angle? Did the panel always look that dark around the seam? And then comes one of the ugliest fears a person can have in bed. A fear that the attic hatch isn't closed properly because someone above wanted it that way. Just enough, not enough to fall open, or enough to be obvious, just enough to let them look through. There are some thoughts that poison the whole room once they arrive. This is one of them, because now the ceiling is no longer a ceiling. Now it's a lid, and the hatch is not a fixture. It's an eyelet, a point of access, a place where watching becomes possible. So picture it properly. You're lying on your back. The room is dark enough that shapes are vague, but not gone. The hatch is above, maybe not directly over you, maybe off to one side, and because the mind is cruel, you picture the panel lowered a fraction. You picture one fingertip on the edge from above. You picture the tiniest line of deeper dark between the plaster and the wood. Then you picture an eye. It's not dramatic or wide, it's just an eye held still in the crack, looking down, looking at you. That's all, but that's enough. Because an eye doesn't need to move to ruin a room. It only needs to be there, looking, calm and patient, certain that you'll eventually notice it. And here's the deeper horror. You don't know how long it has already been there. Now, think about this. Most fears become weaker when they are brought into the light, but attic fear grows because checking it is its own ordeal. If you suspect the wardrobe, you open it. If you suspect under the bed, you kneel down and look. If you suspect the hall, you switch on the landing light and stand in the doorway. But to check the attic, You must do something else entirely. You must fetch the ladder. You must stand directly beneath that hatch. You must reach up. You must pull it down. And then, before the ladder is even steady, before your head is high enough to see across the joists, before your torch has found the far end, you have to place your face level with the opening. That is one of the purest moments of dread a house can offer, because in that moment, you're the one entering its territory. Think about the shape of an attic. Low beams, sloping roof, nails through timber, dust in the air, cobwebs, insulation like dead fur, and old objects with no context. Things kept because nobody wanted to sort them out. Shapes that seem human until the torch moves. Things wrapped in sheets. Family belongings from people who are gone. Suitcases no one opens. Baby clothes, cracked mirrors, toys that were once loved and then put away. Even without anything supernatural, this is a hard place for the mind to stay rational in, because the attic is full of evidence of absence. Everything up there was left behind by someone coming back later, but most never did. And so the place feels unfinished, suspended, held. Now, add sound to it. A faint movement overhead when you're in bed might be one thing, but what about the little drop of dust from the hatch onto your pillow? What about the thin line on the carpet beneath the hatch, where it looks as though something fine has fallen through the seam? What about hearing a soft shift above and then, a few seconds later, hearing something much closer, somewhere inside the wall, beside your bed? Rats can do that. Mice can do that. Squirrels have been known to do that. And once you know that, the whole room changes, because the room is no longer sealed. The house is no longer divided neatly into spaces. Now there are channels, gaps, hollow parts, paths inside the walls. Ways for living things to move above you and beside you without ever crossing the floor in front of your eyes. You stop feeling housed, you start feeling surrounded. Then there are insects. People don't like to think of this one, but it's real. Wasps in the eaves, bluebottles trapped and breeding in heat, spiders in thick, untouched corners. The attic is where a problem can become a colony before anyone understands it, and because it's above the bedrooms, because heat rises, because timber holds warmth, because darkness helps things spread quietly, the attic often becomes the headquarters of whatever the house is growing without permission. That's another genuine fear. Not one thing, many. A hidden multiplication. A nest becomes nests. A few bodies become dozens. A low sound becomes a system. And now, how about this? Sometimes the most upsetting fear isn't that something is in the attic tonight. It's the fear that it has always been there, and that you're only now becoming aware of it because tonight, for some reason, it has become less careful. That thought is foul, because then every memory is contaminated. That night you heard one tap and dismissed it. The morning you noticed a mark near the hatch. The time you thought the insulation smell seemed stronger. The faint dirt on the landing. The missing biscuit, the strange creak at 3:30, the cold feeling that came over you for no reason while brushing your teeth under the hatch. The mind starts gathering old scraps and arranging them into a pattern, and patterns make fear feel earned. Then comes the attic ladder itself, folded up, hidden away, usually harmless, but even that has a kind of threat in it because it suggests use. The hatch isn't decorative, it opens. People go up there, weight is placed on that frame, hands grip that ring, which means the attic isn't sealed at all. It's accessible. The only reason it feels distant is because you have chosen not to go there, and sometimes the most unnerving thing in the house is a space you could check at any time, but you don't. Why? Because part of you already believes checking it would make things worse, because There's a small animal fear in the human mind that says, if you don't stir the dark space, maybe the dark space will leave you alone. That's ancient, that's real, that's older than houses. Now, for another consideration. Imagine you're lying in bed and you hear a very soft bump from above. You wait, another, then a slow drag, then silence. You tell yourself it's the timber cooling. You tell yourself it is the wind outside. You tell yourself it's a bird on the roof. Then you hear something that destroys all that comfort. 3 knocks. Just 3 measured knocks from directly over your bed. What do you do with that? Because once a sound seems deliberate, the body knows before the mind does. The room changes instantly. The dark becomes occupied. The air feels used. You lie still and listen harder, which only gives the silence more power. And the silence after deliberate sound is its own torture because it feels like listening from the other side. Even worse than knocks are slow movements that suggest caution. No animal in a hurry, no wild scramble, just one part of the attic floor taking weight, then another, a shift, a pause, another shift. Careful things are always worse. Careful things suggest purpose, and purpose is where real psychological horror begins. Now think of the houses where the attic hatch is above the bed itself. There are plenty of them. A little square of ceiling just sitting over where a person spends a third of his life defenseless. That alone is enough to settle you once you really let it in. We accept it because we have to. If we don't, half the country would never sleep properly again, because what is sleep under an attic, really? It's surrender under a space you can't monitor. It's trust placed in timber, plaster, and habit. It is the belief that because nothing has happened before, nothing is happening now. But habit is a weak defense. Habit only means you are used to not checking. And this is where the attic becomes such a useful cruelty in the mind. It turns your own common sense against you. The more ordinary the house is, the worse the fear can be. A ruined abbey already announces itself. A castle invites imagination, but an ordinary semi-detached house with a quiet attic over the bedroom asks something much harsher of the imagination, because it says this could happen where you already live. Not in legend, not in some old cursed place. In the house where your toothbrush is in the bathroom and your shoes are by the door and your kettle is on the counter. That is real fear. And then, because your mind enjoys finishing the job once it has started, you begin to wonder about the trapdoor again. Not the whole thing opening, that would almost be easier. No, the real horror is smaller than that. A slight shift, a dark seam growing a fraction wider, a dry fleck of dust falling onto your blanket. The sense, without proof, that there is more black in the corner of the ceiling than there should be. And then that old poisonous question arrives. What if someone is lying flat above it, listening to me breathe? Let that sink in. What if the worst thing about the attic isn't what's stored there, or what nests there, or what creeps through it, but what it represents, a part of the home that remains unknown, a place that has height, darkness, cover, and patience, a place where something can exist without demanding your attention every day, a place that can remain theoretical until one night it doesn't. That is why the attic stays with people. It's not just the dark, it's not just the dust, it's not just the old fears of rats or burglars or hidden spaces. It's the fact that the attic gives fear room to wait overhead. So as you lie there now in your own room, with the ceiling above you and whatever space may or may not be beyond it, perhaps you might do what most people do and tell yourself the same calming things. Old wood, old wiring, wind, pipes, settling, nothing. That may even be true, but when the house goes fully quiet, when there's no traffic outside, when the last ordinary sound has finished and all that remains is the faint presence of the home around you, Listen carefully to what happens to your thoughts when you remember there's a space above your head that you cannot see into from where you lie, because sometimes the fear is not that something is coming down. Sometimes the fear is that something has been there for a very long time, and tonight, for reasons of its own, it has decided to let you know it is awake too. Thomas Riley lived where the village gave out. The road thinned as it went west, then broke into stone and mud, then into two tracks where carts had once gone in drier years. Beyond that there was a patch of low ground where peat had been cut, and beyond that again, half hidden by bent ash trees and rough thorn, stood Thomas's cottage. It had a roof that held in some places and failed in others. One window had been boarded. The door had swollen with rain and only opened if he put his shoulder to it. He kept a few hens in a lean run behind the place. He grew a little. The ground was poor. He took what work he could get where no one had to stand too close to him. He didn't come into the village often. When he did, people saw him before he spoke. They always did. His face was broad and weathered, and in the middle of it his nose sat, large and heavy, shaped in such a way that strangers looked once and then looked again. It wasn't the face of a beast. It was a man's face, plain enough in every other part, but the nose drew the eye and held it there. Children stared, unless they had already been taught better, and most had. Thomas had been taught early what people did with the thing they feared and didn't understand. As a child, he had stayed too long where others played and paid for it. As a young man, he had still gone among people for a while, as if by simple patience he might wear their unease down. He had given that up years ago. He didn't hate them. He didn't brood on it. He had only come to know the shape of his life and step inside it without struggle. If he met someone on a narrow road, they stood aside late and with care, or else they crossed before he reached them. If he entered the local shop for butter or tea, talk bent and then stopped as if a door had closed on it. Coins were taken from his hand quickly. Change was set down on the counter rather than into his palm. Once 2 women had been laughing near the well until he came level with them. Their laughter had gone out so sharply that even the rope against the stone could be heard. He had passed them with a nod and gone on. This is how things were. He had his own habits and kept them. He rose before full light. He fetched water. He checked the hens. If he had day work, he took his coat and went. If he had none, he cut turf, patched fence, mended what weather broke, or walked the edges of the bog and the strip of the wood beyond it. He moved quietly through ground that other men cursed at and lost boots in. He knew where old cuttings lay under green scum. He knew which places looked firm and which were not. He knew where foxes denned and where hares sat tight in the rushes. He knew other things too. He could smell rain long before the clouds came down low enough for other men to notice them. He would be splitting kindling in dry light, then stop and lift his head, and half an hour later the first drops would strike the yard. He could smell a dead sheep carried on the wind from far over the rise and know roughly where it lay. Once, in late autumn, he had smelled burning at dusk and followed it to find a patch of gorse smouldering along a ditch bank where a careless labourer had left a fire. He had beaten it out with a sack before it reached the field beyond. No one thanked him for that. By the time the owner came, saw the black patch, and heard how it had been stopped, the telling had already changed enough to place Thomas near the fire before it was seen. He had gone home before the man arrived. In early spring, when the ground still held winter in it, he saw the mayor's son twice in 1 week. The boy's name was Porrick Keane. He was 9, small for his age, quick in his limbs, and forever where he had not been told to be. He climbed what could be climbed and crossed what had not been made for crossing. He was the kind of child who went under carts, through hedges, over walls, and came back with torn sleeves and bright eyes. His father, Sean, was proud of him in the way fathers often are with sons who carry their life on the outside. The first time Thomas saw the boy that week, Porrick was by the forge with a stick for a sword and fighting invisible enemies. The child's mother called from a doorway and he pretended not to hear. Thomas had gone to collect a sack of meal left for him by a farmer who preferred to deal in leaving things rather than speaking face to face. As Thomas came from the yard, Porrick ran straight across his path and nearly struck him with his stick. He stopped dead, looked up at him and blinked. Thomas expected the usual change then. He had seen it often enough in children who had been thoughtless for a second and only after that remembered what they'd been told. The face would stiffen, the eyes would go wide, and then the child would step back. Porrick only said, "Sorry," and grinned, as if he'd nearly collided with any other man in the parish. Thomas gave one slow nod, and the boy ran on. The second time was closer to the edge of the village, where the last cottages looked toward the bog. Thomas had been walking the far ditch. Porrick was crouched by the road, peering at something in the grass. He looked up as Thomas passed. "Is there really a fox's earth in the wood?" he asked. Thomas looked at him for a moment. There is." "Have you seen it?" "Yes, I have." Porrick waited, perhaps for more, but Thomas had none to give. The boy seemed content with that. He only scratched at his knee, nodded to himself, and went back to whatever held his attention in the ditch. That evening, Thomas thought of the exchange once, and then let it go. The day the boy went missing began dry and bright, with wind moving soft across the bog from the south. Thomas had spent the morning mending a stretch of boundary fence beyond a field that wasn't his. The farmer who owned it had left the wire and the tools and would leave a loaf and a few coins on a stone later once Thomas was well gone. By mid-afternoon, the light had flattened. There was damp coming in, though no one in the village below would yet have smelt it. Thomas had. It came under the usual sense of turf and wet grass and old wood and the thin sourness of the bog pools. He was carrying cut hazel back toward the cottage when he heard shouting. At first it was only one voice, then another, then many, spread across distance. He stopped where the track narrowed between two clumps of thorn and listened. There was urgency in it, men calling to each other, women calling a name, a child's name. He stood and let the air come to him. There was wood smoke from the village, damp earth, sheep, a faint smell of horse. Then, beneath those, thinner but distinct, stagnant water and disturbed peat from somewhere deeper in the low ground west of the village. He turned his head slightly, catching it better. There was also the smell of wool soaked right through, though that told him little by itself. He listened again. "Porrick." The name carried clear on a break in the wind. Thomas set the hazel down. For some moments he didn't move. He looked toward the village and then toward the bog beyond the stretch of birch where boys sometimes strayed after birds' nests or rabbit holes or nothing more than their own wandering feet. He knew what had happened well enough. Not in detail, not yet, but enough. The child was lost. The village was searching. No one would come to his cottage. No one would ask for his help. If he went and found the boy, and if the boy was hurt or still, and if Thomas brought him back in his arms, he didn't finish the thought, because there was no need. He had lived among these people too long. He could leave it there. Others were already searching. Men with lanterns would spread across the fields soon enough. They would go calling through the wood. They would find the boy by dark or by morning. That could happen without him. There was no duty laid on him by any man in the village, no kindness owed him, no welcome waiting. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the low land where the smell of water and churned peat drifted up through the rushes. Then he took the track west. He moved quickly, but not wildly. The ground wouldn't allow that, and he knew better than to try. He followed where the scent drew stronger, angling away from the road and into a rough stretch where birch roots broke the skin of the earth and the ground sank under reeds and brown sedge. The light had begun to fail around the edges. Birds lifted from the scrub ahead and then settled again. Twice he stopped to test the ground with the long hazel staff he had taken up on the way. Once he turned aside from a patch that shone dark and still because the smell there was old and deep and would take a man to his knee before he could wrench free. The child's trace came and went, but the disturbed place drew him on. Broken stems, mud newly turned, the stale breath of bog water lifted where it had been stirred. He found one small shoe first. It had come off in the sucking ground and lay half on its side among black water and grass. Thomas looked at it, then raised his eyes and searched ahead. 10 yards farther on, the reeds were bent flat in a line toward one of the narrow cuts where the water sat under a skin of weed and peat. He went there and looked down. The boy lay on his side, half in the water, one arm under him, his chest against the bank. Mud had dried on one hand in a dark crust. His clothes were soaked. A little bit of reed was caught in his hair. Thomas set the hazel down and knelt carefully on firmer ground. "Porrick!" The boy didn't stir. Thomas put one broad hand to the child's shoulder and turned him enough to see the face. The skin had gone pale in the way that told its own truth at once. The mouth stood slightly open. Water had dried at one nostril. Thomas put his fingers where he knew there should be life and found none. He touched the chest then, though he didn't know why. It gave him nothing either. For a few seconds he stayed where he was, bent over the child, one knee in the mud, his face empty of all but tired recognition. Then he lifted the boy from the bank. He did it with care, as if care could still matter. The child was light, lighter than a sack of meal, and harder to hold because he had once been full of movement. Thomas drew him against his chest and rose. Water ran from the boy's coat and dripped from Thomas's sleeve. He looked toward the village, though there was little to see now beyond smoke and dim roofs through deepening dusk. He knew how it would look. He knew that before the first doorway opened, before the first woman saw him, before the first man came running. He knew it in the same plain way he knew where the ground broke under moss and where rain sat behind a line of hills before it reached the road. He knew it and still began to walk. The path back seemed longer, though he took it as straight as the land allowed. The boy's head rested against Thomas's shoulder with every jolt of his step. Once the child's arm slipped loose and Thomas gathered it back with clumsy gentleness. The sky had sunk into evening. A little smoke hung low over the village. Dogs barked somewhere ahead. Voices still called from different directions, farther apart now. As Thomas neared the first cottage, he slowed. A woman stood in a doorway. She saw him, but didn't understand what she saw. Another figure crossed behind her, inside the house. Thomas kept walking. A cart stood by the side of the road. A lantern had been lit outside the forge and gave a poor yellow shape to whatever it touched. Then Moira Dalton came out from between two cottages carrying a pail, and she looked up. The pail dropped from her hand and struck the ground, spilling water across the stones. For the space of one breath, she was still. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Her eyes went from Thomas's face to the child in his arms and fixed there. Then the scream burst out of her so sharply that it seemed to split the evening in two. Men came at once, one from the forge, two from the lane by the chapel wall, another from the far side of the square. Voices rose over voices. Someone shouted the boy's name, someone else shouted Thomas's. A dog began barking in a mad highway that wouldn't stop. Thomas had taken no more than 2 steps into the confusion when Shane Keane pushed through it. The father had no hat on. His hair was damp against his head as if he had been running hard. He saw the child first. Thomas knew that at once. He saw the dead weight in the arms, the hanging hands, the mud on the clothes. Then Sean's eyes lifted and fixed on Thomas. I found him, Thomas said. The first blow struck him before he could say more. It came from the side and knocked him hard against the cart shaft. He didn't fall because he was still holding the boy. Another man seized the child from his arms then, and in the same instant, 2 others were on Thomas. The square became all shove and noise and boots on stone. Somebody hit him across the face. Somebody drove a fist into the side of his head. He lifted one arm, perhaps to ward it off, perhaps only because the body does such things when pain begins. It changed nothing. He didn't fight them as another man might have done. He was broad enough and strong from work. Had he swung back in the first seconds, he might have put 1 or 2 down, but he didn't. Whether it was shock or certainty or some old habit of taking what came once a crowd had decided what he was, no one could have said. He tried only to stay upright. When he lost that, they beat him to the ground. It was quick, then boots, kicks, a heel against the ribs, hands dragging him half over, then another strike to the face. The noise around him changed shape, but didn't lessen. Women cried out. Men shouted over one another. Somewhere close by, Sean Keane made a sound that was more animal than speech. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, something in it faltered. "Wait," a voice said. No one listened. "Wait, for God's sake." This time there was force in it. A man knelt by the boy where he had been laid on the stones. Thomas couldn't see well by then. Blood had gone into one eye and the lantern light had become a smear. But he heard movement around the child, heard the shift in the breathing of the crowd, heard one man say quietly, "Look at his clothes." The voice near the child spoke again, lower. "He's full of bog water." No one answered. "The side of his head," the voice said. "That's the mark of a fall. And look at the mud on him. This boy slipped."
"How can you tell?"
another voice said. "I've seen this before. I work in the morgue." Silence spread in pieces. A boot that had been drawn back for another kick settled to the ground. Sean Keane knelt by his son. He touched the boy's hair, the coat, the cold face. His hand came back wet with the bog still on the cloth. He looked at the damp on his fingers for a second that seemed to hold the whole village in it, and then he turned his head. Thomas was lying by his side near the cart wheel, one arm trapped under him. His coat had ridden up at the back. Mud and blood had mixed along his cheek and at the corner of his mouth. One eye was shut entirely. The other remained open by a little, whether he saw them then, whether he heard all that passed in the silence after, no one later could agree. No one moved to help him. No speech came. No man stepped forward to say he had struck first or hardest. No woman tried to put words over what stood plain in the square. The village that had shouted itself into action now stood as if speech had been taken from it. Lantern lights shook in one hand. Moira Dalton had both palms over her mouth. The dog at last had gone quiet. Sean Keane looked from his son to Thomas and back again. Whatever came into him then showed only once, and only in the way his shoulders seemed to drop all at once, as if something inside had been cut loose. He reached a hand out, not toward Thomas exactly, but in that direction, and then he let it fall before it touched anything. By the time the priest was sent for, Thomas Riley was dead. They carried the boy home first. That too was noticed and remembered. Thomas was taken after, on a door lifted from its hinges. No one argued with that. No one argued with anything by then. The men who bore him did it stiffly, with their eyes averted from his face. He was placed in the little chapel shed until morning because no one knew where else to put him. His cottage stood empty at the edge of the bog, with the hens unsettled in their run, and the door still pushed to from when he had left it. They buried Porrick in the churchyard 3 days later. Thomas was buried beyond the wall with little attendance and no speech worth keeping. Yet the story didn't end there, for people in that place said afterwards that the village was never easy again. It began in small ways. Milk soured between morning and dusk. Hens stopped laying. A child woke shrieking and wouldn't say what stood at the foot of the bed. Men crossing the bog at first light heard steps keeping pace with them out in the mist where no person could be seen. Once, in summer, every dog in the square began barking at once and then tucked tail and bolted for home, though the road stood empty from end to end. Older people spoke low of the other folk and a balance upset. They say there are gifts put into the world in strange forms, and foolish men, seeing only the form, lay hands on what they should have left in peace. They said Thomas Riley had carried a mark that made people turn away, but he'd carried something else with it too, and the fair ones, who measured things by laws of their own, had taken note of what was done to him. Nothing open ever came of it. No house was burned, no man vanished, yet a kind of unease settled over the place that didn't lift for many years. Fields failed without reason, good horses shied at empty gates. More than one villager, passing the west road at dusk, thought he smelled peat water and cold reeds when the air was otherwise dry, and walked faster without knowing why. And if any child asked in later years who lay beyond the church wall, the older ones would answer shortly and then send them on. But some of the oldest, when no priest was near and the evening had come down, would say that Thomas Riley had gone into death as he had gone through life, knowing the measure of other people and doing the decent thing, all the same. They said he took payments for merchants before he ever heard people out. They said he let contracts pass through his own friends and called it good management. They said he promised repairs to roads, walls, storehouses and wells, then signed the money elsewhere and let the work die on paper. They said he raised local charges in the name of order and improvement, though no one could point to anything improved except the cut of his coat and the polish on his boots. They said he kept 2 sets of numbers, one for meetings, one for the truth. They said he turned public shortages into private gain. They said he let grain leave the district while families here paid more for less. They said he dined with shop owners after dark and settled the price of bread before the bakers ever lit the ovens. They said he spoke of hardships as if it were a lesson poor people ought to be grateful for. They said he smiled while men went without coal and women watered stew to make it last another night. They said all of this. They said it often. They said it low at first, then louder, then in company. And the man they meant was Enda Macken. He was the sort of politician who shouted. That was part of what made him so hard to bear. He never needed to lose his temper. He had a polished way of speaking that made anger sound childish and hunger sound temporary. He could look at a man whose wages hadn't risen in years and speak to him as if the real problem was impatience. He could stand in a fine coat with his gloves tucked neatly beneath one arm and explain to women who had begun cutting their own loaves thinner that sacrifices was sometimes the price of progress. By the spring of that year, the town had reached the point where talk was no longer enough. Flour had gone up again, coal had gone up, lamp oil had gone up. A pound of butter cost more than any decent person could defend. Meat was dear enough already, but now even the poor cuts had begun slipping out of reach. A man could work 6 days and still stand at a counter on Saturday evening trying to decide whether bread or heat mattered more. The shopkeepers blamed supply, the carriers blamed weather, the merchants blamed the roads, and every road led in one way or another to Enda Macken. So the people gathered. It wasn't a riot, it wasn't even close to one. The first men stood at the square with their caps on and their hands in their pockets. Then women came, then more men from the outlying roads. A cart was delayed, then another. Boys ran messages back and forth. A horse snorted and stamped beside a trapped wagon. The whole square began to hold itself in a tight, waiting way. Some wanted Macken shouted down. Some wanted him gone from the district entirely. Some only wanted him forced to answer plainly for once in his miserable life. By late morning, there were enough people there that the thing could no longer be ignored. Word was sent, another came back, and then another. It was said that he would address them. That settled nothing, but it held them in place. Enda Macken arrived just before noon. He came by carriage and stepped down with the same composure he carried into every room. He took a glance at the crowd, the way a schoolmaster might look over a class that had grown noisy in his absence. There was annoyance in his face, perhaps, but no fear that showed itself. The platform had been put up for him in a hurry, and when he mounted it, the square shifted and quieted by degrees. Not from respect, mind you, from waiting. The day was bright and cold enough that breath still showed faintly in the shade. Enda removed one glove, then the other, and set his notes before him, though he hardly looked at them. He picked up the bullhorn, cleared his throat, and placed it to his mouth. When he began, his voice went out clean over the crowd.
Look, you've all made your feelings plain, he said. I've heard them. I've heard the complaints. I've heard the fears.
A murmur rose at the last word. He lifted a hand, calm as ever.
But fear, he said. Look, no, fear is a poor guide in matters of economy.
There were groans at that. A few men at the front spoke over him, but he continued.
The district is changing. Trade is changing. Costs shift. Supply shifts. Demand shifts. None of this is personal, however much some among you seem eager to paint it so.
He turned slightly as he spoke, addressing first one side of the square and then the other. He had the habit of doing that, making everyone feel spoken at and dismissed in equal measure.
Look, if prices have risen, it's because conditions require it. If certain adjustments have been made, it's because they were necessary.
That word came hard then from the crowd.
Necessary?
A woman shouted.
For who?
Others took it up. For who?
For who?
For who? Enda didn't answer at once. He let the noise spend itself.
Look at, for all of us, he said at last. Though I accept that some here may be less able than others to see beyond the present discomfort.
A man near the front barked out a laugh so bitter that the others joined him.
Discomfort, someone said. Will you listen to the bastard?
Enda heard it. He looked straight toward the voice and gave the small, patient smile that had made so many hate him.
Look, what you call discomfort, he said, I would call it transition. And transition is never pleasant to those determined to remain where they are.
That did it. The square broke into open shouting then. Men spoke over one another. A woman near the cart road began naming prices aloud one by one, each worse than the last. Another shouted what her husband earned last week. Someone called Macken a thief. Someone else called him worse. Still, he stood there, hands placed neatly, and waited. When enough noise had passed, he spoke again.
You're being misled, he said, by rumour, by grievance, by those who profit from disorder more than I ever could.
It was a fine line, almost beautiful in the way a lie can be when spoken by a man who has had long practice. He told them the district was being modernized. He told them short pain prevented long decline. He told them roads would improve, trade would strengthen, and in time they would all see the value of the measures they now cursed. He told them he worked for stability. He told them he worked for order. He told them, without ever putting it so crudely, that he understood their lives better than they did. And when he was finished, he set the bullhorn down, gathered his papers, stepped down, and left them with nothing but his polished voice hanging in the air where food should have been. The crowd didn't chase them. Some shouted after the carriage. Some stood in silence, disgusted beyond words. The protest broke slowly, not because they were satisfied, but because there was nowhere for fury to go that afternoon but home. Over the next day or two, the town settled into the talk that follows a public insult. At counters, on roads outside the church wall, in yards where washing had been brought in early against the weather. People repeated these words and made them filthier by repeating them. Men imitated his tone. women repeated transition with such contempt that even children began saying it for mockery. Then came word that Enda Macken had taken ill. The first report was vague enough. A cough, they said, a bad one. Then, by evening, it became 2 reports, then 4, and by the following morning the whole town knew that something was seriously amiss. He had taken to his bed. He had been sick through the night. He had coughed until he could hardly draw another breath. Some said it was a chill. Some said his lungs had given way. One woman said that she had heard from a cousin in service that he had brought up blood into a basin so hard and so often that the cloths couldn't be washed clean after. By afternoon, the stories darkened. He couldn't keep food down. He couldn't speak above a shred of breath. He had begun clutching at his chest and sighed as though something sharp were being worked through him from the inside. The doctor was called, then called again. A priest, too, though not at first. Men like Enda Macken didn't welcome the priest too early if they could help it. Too much truth comes into a room when a priest enters before a man is ready. The doctor could point to nothing certain. There was no wound on him, no fever of the sort that explains such speed, no ordinary sickness anyone in the town recognized. Whatever had started in him had started low and deep and gone about its work with terrible purpose. On the second night, the coughing worsened. It racked him so violently that 2 servants had to hold him when he tried to raise from the bed. He spat blood, then more. By morning his voice had worn down to almost nothing. He was heard trying to ask for water and failing to get the word out whole. He died before the next evening. Not a quiet death. There were sounds from the room, it was said, that the household didn't speak of after. One servant left the place within a week and wouldn't say why. Another said only that no one deserved to go that way, then crossed herself and refused every other question put to her. The town received the news with the sort of silence that is not sorrow but stillness. Enda Macken had been hated, but even hatred pauses before a death that ugly. Men shook their heads, women lowered their voices. A few said that perhaps judgment had come quickly for once. The burial was arranged. People attended because people always attend, and because even a corrupt man must be put into the ground by somebody. There was no warmth in it, no real grief in the faces nearest the grave, only duty and weather and the muttering of the priest. When it was done, the town went on. That Friday evening the pub filled as it always did. The fire was up, glasses knocked softly on wood. Damp coats steamed near the door. Men sat in groups and took the death apart from every angle they could manage. The talk moved through ordinary possibilities first. Bad lungs, a hidden illness, a curse from a bitter woman. Then, as the night deepened and the pints lowered what stood between thought and speech, the talk bent into an older direction.
It was the fairies,
said one man near the hearth. A couple of lads laughed at that, but not with much strength. The man held his ground.
You laugh, he said, but I'm telling you, there's limits to what can be done in a place. There's ways of carrying on that stirs things up.
You think the good people are setting coal prices now? Another asked.
No,
said the first.
I think they watch. I think they see. I think some men just go too far.
That got more silence than laughter. A farmer with rough hands wrapped around his glass leaned in and said he had left cream at the edge of the hawthorn field on the night after the speech. Not as a bargain, he said, not asking anything, only showing respect and asking that balance be restored where men had spoiled it. Another man said his wife had done the same with a piece of good meat. Someone else said his mother had prayed, not to God that night, but to the old crowd in the hills, because there were wrongs, he said, that belonged to older hands. That made a few cross themselves. It made a few others not. One old fellow by the bar said the fairies would forgive an ordinary sinner soon enough, but not a man who made hunger for profit and then stood before the hungry to call it wisdom. There was agreement at that, a strange kind of agreement too, because it was half belief and half desire. Some men in the room believed what they were saying. Others wanted to. Most sat somewhere in the middle, willing enough to let the old world step in if it meant a cruel man had been dealt with. The stories grew as drink does. A woman had heard music near the fort on the night Macken died. A dog had howled at an empty field. One labourer swore he'd seen lights moving low among the hedges. Each tale strengthened the next. Enda Macken became smaller in death than he had been in life, and the room enjoyed that. At the far end of the bar sat a man who said almost nothing all evening. He was a big man with a plain face and the sort of steady hands people trust without noticing they do. He drank slowly and listened. Now and then the edge of a smile touched his mouth, though not enough to invite questions. He had been among those hired to erect the platform in the square that morning. He had carried timber, he had fixed the stand upright. He had done the kind of work no one remembers once the thing is built and the speaker takes it over. When the talk of fairies swelled again beside him, he lowered his eyes into his glass. It hadn't been fairies. He knew exactly what it had been. In the weeks before the protest, while the town talked and the prices climbed and Macken went on smiling, the man had been collecting what he needed. Not from any chemist, not from any tidy bottle with a label tied around its neck. From hedgerows, sheds, and scraps of knowledge passed quietly between practical people who knew which things burned the skin, which things troubled the lungs, which things a man ought never put his face too near once ground fine enough. He had dried the materials himself. He had crushed it patiently. He had mixed it into a pale dust and kept it right tightly into the morning of that speech. No one had watched him because no one watches a labourer doing labouring work. He had handled the stand, shifted the fittings, wiped the metal clean where it needed wiping, and when his back was turned from the square from one ordinary moment among many ordinary moments, he had worked the powder along the inside of the bullhorn in a thin coat no eye would catch unless it had reason to look. Then he set it in place and stepped away. That was all. Each word Enda Macken gave the crowd had required a breath. Each breath had drawn the dust further in, deep enough, slow enough, nothing to waste, nothing to see, nothing to make a man stop in the middle of speaking and wonder. The worker had known it wouldn't take him there in the square. It was never meant to. The point was not spectacle. The point was certainty. Let him finish. Let him go home. Let the sickness begin later, beyond the reach of suspicion, when all that remained of the day in people's minds was his voice and their anger. Around him, the pub went on building its own explanation. A man by the fire said the fairies had no patience left for officials. Another said good luck to them if that was so. The worker raised his glass and took a drink to hide the smile that came then, because there was a pleasure in hearing old powers given credit for a thing done by a pair of human hands. No one asked his opinion, no one looked at him twice. He was exactly what he had been all week in their eyes, another man from the town, another back bent to whatever work needed doing, another face in a room of faces. That suited him. Outside, the village road lay damp and dark. Inside, the pub held its warmth and rumour and pious old fear. The fairies, it was said again and again, had seen enough. They had been offered bread, milk, cream, prayers, respect. They had restored balance where the law had failed. The worker set down his empty glass and let that pass over him too. There was no need to correct them. A better story had already taken hold. And there at the far end of that bar, while the others spoke of hawthorn trees and old powers and justice from beyond the hedge, he sat with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd built the platform, set the voice in place, and listened 2 days later as the district buried it. When you wake in the morning, please like, subscribe, and leave a small comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Those quiet words and clicks are what keep this place alive. The soft signs that let the stories return again and again to you and to others. Come back every night. Let this be your resting place. Good night.